We're going to look at the situation in Flint, Michigan, which has been on the top of mind of everyone in this country. It took far too long for it to be at the top of our minds, but it is now, and we know that the work is just beginning rather than coming to an end. So we're excited to learn from these leaders and see what's next.
Morning. Big day yesterday, as Jenny said. We end this panel at,
I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
10:30. What? 10:30. So, Democracy Undone, the Flint, Michigan public health crisis, which is really a Michigan crisis. And we need to be really clear and honest about that yesterday. Ian Haney-Lopez said something very powerful yesterday morning. If we want an inclusive democracy, if progressives, if young folks, if we really want an inclusive democracy with real leaders at the table, really engaging, then we have to take on not just the issue of race and discussion, but the challenges that they face in all of our everyday lives, because it impacts us all. You all know the story. It is under the national spotlight, 18 months of grassroots, families, parents, mothers, brothers, daughters, sons, corporations, hospitals, challenged with the very basic issue of water. But it really isn't an 18-month story. And it really, at the end of the day, isn't about the water. It really, really is about our democracy, our government, and the people's role in it. I'll be really honest. For 17 years, I called Michigan my home, since last August. And I've been a leader in the trade union movement, played a role in the auto industry, done door knocking in most communities, many of which are communities of color. I've seen the wealth, the ups, the downs, the lows, but you cannot ever believe that you would ever tell me that in the town of Flint, that once was the home of a most powerful union, where people made great change, where I lived about, I don't know, Kary, 60 miles, 55, 60 miles. I read that newspaper. I read it. I saw it. And I have to ask myself, as many people are struggling with, how did that happen on our watch? I don't want to spend a lot of time reflecting on that, but I know it's challenging for us. We're all feeling like we got there maybe too late. We really want to help, but we don't know how. We don't want to overshadow the voice of those that have toiled and, organized and worked on the ground for for years. We don't want to come in, but it is a threat. It is emblematic of what is happening across our nation, and there's a complete reason for it. I said to my daughter last night, I don't really know what I'm going to say or how I will frame the panel. And she said two things. Don't get too deep and don't cry. It is what Ian Haney-Lopez said yesterday. It's about power. And our job is to return that power to the people. It's really that simple. Return local governance to those people, to give them their right to redress of grievances, so that when you think about how many times you turned on a tap this morning and didn't have to worry about the water, to brush your teeth, take a shower, to drink it, that we have a responsibility as a movement, as a good government groups, that is not just a basic right for a few people, but for every single person in Michigan, in Detroit, in Illinois, wherever you may be. So I'm going to stop and say the root cause of many of this is the emergency manager, a role of emergency manager. It is a law that has been on the books since 1988 in Michigan. Been utilized many times, but around 2011, when the current sitting governor came in, began to use that law to assert control of cities. That in 9 cities is that it's been over since between 11 and today. At one point, 52% of the African Americans in the state lived under emergency manager or a court, some sort of state control. That nine cities, Detroit being one of the largest. There was a ballot initiative that happened in 2012 where the people said, look, you can't come in and strip local governance. You can't strip people's power away. You can't come in and take out collective bargaining agreements. They said no. We did a ballot initiative, people won, and the state legislature went back into the lame duck session and overruled that decision. And not only did they put the ballot initiative back in place, it strengthened their hand with it. There's nothing an emergency manager can't do. They're appointed by the governor. They report to the governor. They use that to go around every rule, every regulation. I think the only thing they can't do is miss a bond payment. Am I right on that? The only thing they cannot do is miss a bond payment. 19 states have this kind of law, Michigan being the broadest. It is not a lot of history and experience here around the law, but there's many, many ways, alternative ways to deal with a fiscal crisis. The purpose of the panel today is to do a couple things. One, listen to and hear from a woman who lives in Flint, Michigan, grew up in Flint, Michigan, and will talk to you about how the grassroots organizing, what it was like to organize, not just an emergency manager around Flint, but couple years before that led up to the crisis. We will also examine and what that support is needed today to really help them build a powerful organization and be supported in Flint. Second part of the panel is to look at what it took to put their plight and address those issues and validate the concerns, be able to file legal proceedings, to begin to create the forum for accountability, I'm struggling because I will say this to you. Imagine yourself going in with a dirty glass of water and saying something's wrong and your kid has got a rash. and no one will listen to you. So part of this is really understanding how and why we had to put together an ability to basically validate their stories and their claims. We want to end the panel by saying, what are the alternatives? These fiscal crises aren't unique. There's ways to think about this as an investment. Will it bring resources? How do we deal with these? We have urban cities crumbling across this country, bridges, roads, jobs, investment, and we will look at that. We have 3 people that I want to introduce to you. I'm sorry, I really, really want to say this. It's just bugging me. We are not, the response to the crisis today is not adequate. If you just, for a minute. While we're having lots of debates and lots of meetings and having this discussion, if this was Katrina, if this was a hurricane, if this was a tornado, there would be real resources that met the needs of people's daily lives in that city. There are no porta showers. There are no ways to get big water. If you want to bathe your baby, get a bunch of those. If you don't have a car, you can't put it in. We also, while we're having this conversation about our democracy, have to make sure that the response is adequate for everyone, that the people in the city have a voice and a say, that their health needs are dealt with, that the ongoing issues around the transparency and accountability around the testing and what the current state of the water levels are has to happen. There's many groups on the ground like NAACP who are calling for that. So I don't want to make it seem like while we're having this conversation, all is well and things are happening on the ground. It is not. So for that, we have to really support and really think about what will be the call to arms around making sure that there's a grand, broad response that deepens and takes care of people. So, thank you. So we have Nayyirah Shariff, who's an activist, Democracy Defense League. She's a grassroots organizer with nearly 10 years' experience, and she has been working on emergency manager in the state. Kary Moss, my friend, my sister, who's been a director at ACLU Michigan for 18 years, built a program to prioritize the quality of public education over incarceration, school to prison pipeline. She has a staff of 24, 3 offices in Michigan. She filed the first case in the country after 9/11, challenging John Ashcroft's decision to close deportation hearings to press and public. Judge Keith said, democracy dies behind closed doors, which is part of what really happened here in Flint. We have Mike Ettlinger, who's the founding director of the Carsey School of Public Policy in New Hampshire. He's a long history in progressive economic citizens for tax justice, senior leader at the EPI, who was responsible for EARN Network, and the vice president of CAP. So we will start with Nayyirah.
Can you hear me? Okay, there you go. Thank you. The emergency manager law is a new model for both austerity and what privatization could look like in the United States. And once you peel back the layers of who benefits from this law, and by looking through the leasing and the contracts that are awarded, and the various executive orders and resolutions passed by the various emergency managers around the state, you see that it will very closely match up with donor lists for some of the elected officials. And you can't tackle the Flint water crisis without first unpacking the emergency manager law, because in Michigan, and especially in Flint, we have both a water crisis and a democracy crisis. the goal of the emergency manager law is to put public resources into private hands. And the ideology of profit by any means necessary, and as I like to call the emergency manager law, the Friends, Family, and Donor Plan, is inherent in driving the decision to move off the Detroit Water and Sewer Department and to utilize the Flint River as our drinking water source. So the history of the Democracy Defense League actually began with the passage of Public Act 4 in 2011 because I was part of a group called Stand Up for Democracy, which was the public action committee that formed to drive the referendum to repeal Public Act 4 2011, which was the original emergency manager law. And we had, at the time, we also had Occupy Flint, which was our local Occupy encampment. And in November of 2011, we had our election day where we elected a mayor. And on that day, and it was about 2 o'clock, the announcement was made that Flint was going to be receiving an emergency manager and we were going under receivership. And December 1st, 2011, the emergency manager, which was Mike Brown, the first emergency manager, actually became into power. And one of the things that happens with the emergency manager when they come into a community, they automatically zero out the salaries of your elected officials, and the emergency manager decides how much they're going to make and what their responsibilities are going to be. And the emergency manager, what he did was his first set of executive orders was giving our elected officials job responsibilities and also removing in the city of Flint our grievance process, both for residents with the elimination and firing of the entire ombudsman's office, then also for employees with the elimination of our Civil Service Commission. And both of our groups, the Democracy Defense League and Occupy Flint, we actually, the Stand Up for Democracy and Occupy Flint, we actually wanted to specifically confront Flint's emergency manager, and that was kind of the origins of what eventually became the Democracy Defense League. And we did a variety of things. We worked on the repeal campaign. We were trying to really organize and trying to lift the narrative that this is what fascism could look like in the United States, and we really needed to organize to confront it. But one of the things that really was, I would say, troubling for me personally was because the city of Flint, we were under receivership before, so you had a lot of people who, under the previous emergency financial manager law, which did not have the powers of this current law, there were a lot of people who were not willing to organize with us because they felt it was a necessary evil, including some of our elected officials. They felt that if they were silent and sort of complacent, that we would get through this, and it's a painful process, but we're gonna eventually have our democracy back. Then on top of that, you had organizations and entities who felt like they could still, I would say, treat with dictators, and felt that they could still utilize the same methods that they had under a democracy to try to make compromises and get things done. And our response to them was read the law, like they do not have to meet with you, they don't have to face any sort of repercussions that you may bring to bear because they don't report to the people, they report to the governor and to the state treasurer. And in 2014, the decision was made that we were going to be using the Flint River after we moved away from the Detroit Water and Sewer Department, and to build a new, build a new pipeline and a regional authority where we're still kind of facing some things around that. And as we were moving with the emergency manager law, the implementation in Flint was a perversion of the democratic process because we still had, our governor who was out, not a governor, but our mayor was out there cutting ribbons and kissing babies. We still had a city council that was meeting, and people who did not, who were kind of low information or not really engaged in the local political process still felt that we had a functioning meant, and we did not. So that also was one of the narratives that we had to fight, because if people don't know that the rights that they have, they don't know when those rights are taken away. So through the whole water crisis, and as we were fighting and organizing to eventually trying to get back to Detroit, because we had a variety of issues happening with the 18 months that we were on the Flint River. We had E. coli, we had Safe Drinking Water Act violations, and then the lead contamination, the lead exposure for the community. There are different things that you have to do, and people did not have necessarily the correct information to deal with each one of those crises. And as the governor, and as you are looking through the email dumps, you can kind of see the callous disregard that he had with the protesters, and how he actually felt about our community at that point, and still like today. But I kind of want to finish with this, because we had to organize ourselves, because there weren't like the formal organizations, they weren't with us. So we created our own identities and eventually reached out and received validators to validate our anecdotal narratives and our visuals, and just fighting back the narrative of the state that our water was safe. And then it was like even worse than we could even imagine, because what's happening in Flint right now, we have people who could not even fathom that their government would lie to them. So they're kind of walking around with post-traumatic stress disorder. Then also, as I eventually co-founded a new coalition called Flint Rising to really respond to this water crisis, because we have, as we were going and with the state declaration of emergency, we discovered very quickly within 2 weeks that the undocumented community did not know that there was lead contamination. They actually discovered it when their families are calling from their countries of origin that there is lead exposure, and going onto the state's website, there were no materials translated into Spanish. So we had to actually go out and go door to door to actually give accurate information. Then next, going and discovering that the public housing and Section 8 housing was not receiving water. And that actually became like the origins of Flint Rising, which is now a new coalition that's responding to this. And I always say that we're doing the state's job for them, because the state response is just inadequate. And right now, if you go to the fire stations, which is the state-sanctioned distribution sites, you could only get now 2 cases of water per day, which is not enough to meet the needs of a family or a person, because people are cooking and bathing and drinking bottled water. And so you don't really have the dignity that you feel like a human being deserves, as we're facing this. And there is continued perversion and abuses by the state of Michigan in the midst of this quote unquote recovery effort. And as we are going and fighting the fight, at the state level and the federal level, the state is really trying to cherry pick solutions and does not see this as a public health disaster. And we do not have the money necessarily from the federal level, because Obama did not declare Flint a disaster zone. We're only a federal emergency, so we don't have FEMA coming in with water buffaloes and big 55-gallon drums, and we just have money for bottled water and filters, which, giving the new testing and independent testing, is probably not even enough and not really addressing all of the health needs that we have. Because what's the price tag? Right now they have all these price tags to replace the infrastructure, but we have people who are the pipes are disintegrating in their homes. Their quality of life is eroded. I now have seizures and cannot drive. So what's the price tag on that?
Kary.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Kary Moss, and let me just first recognize Nayyirah's immense contribution. This woman has been toiling for years now on this problem, 2 years, in fact, specifically just on the lead water crisis. And I just want to thank you so much for your work. My own journey as the director of the ACLU of Michigan, actually before I even became the director in Flint, began 20-some years ago when I sued a power plant that was being erected in a very poor community in Flint that was going to be emitting lead in a neighborhood where there already were elevated levels of lead poisoning. Can you hear me? Is that better? Okay. So I personally have felt a tremendous connection to this community for many years. What I'm going to talk to you about now is just from my seat as the director of a state-based advocacy organization and how this unfolded and kind of what it took to bring this crisis that had been going on for 2 years to the level that it's at now. And the 5-minute summary here is that about in January 2015, well, I'm sorry, let me start a year before that. I hired an investigative reporter. No ACLU office has ever had an investigative reporter, and we hired one because we were really concerned about the impact of the emergency manager laws because of the tremendous powers that they have that have been described. And the secrecy with which essentially they could operate. I said to a funder, you know, we've got to know what's going on. There's no way we're going to know what's going on unless we can really have somebody on the ground. And given the state of journalism today, I don't know how much we can rely on the established media industry. And so hired somebody, Kurt Guyette, who for a year was focused on what was going on in DPS in Detroit, in the Detroit Public Schools, as it went through bankruptcy. And then we were getting calls from people in Flint complaining about the water. Smelled bad, tasted bad, people were breaking out rashes, and they were getting these astronomical water bills and being, you know, told to pay for it. So Kurt started to go up to Flint and meet with people, and he met a woman named Leanne Walters, whose son had tested positive for lead. And she was very frustrated because she felt the local media were not responding to concerns. And and Kurt did a video and telling her story and other stories. And then that led to, she at the same time was talking to an EPA official named Miguel del Toro. He is very experienced with lead poisoning and water and lead and corrosion controls, and he couldn't believe what she was telling him, which is that there was no corrosion control in the Flint water system. And just for those who may not know, for 50 years, Flint used the Detroit River safely, no problems. The city wanted to move to a new regional authority. Detroit never cut them off, contrary to what the governor has said happened. But the real question became what to do in the interim before the new regional authority was built. And a decision was made by the emergency manager to use the Flint River, and somebody made a decision to not use corrosion controls. The Flint River is commonly known as General Motors sewer. And so here you have this switch happen, and nobody is listening to the complaints. So Miguel del Toro can't believe that they would do this and not use corrosion controls. He looks into the levels of lead in Leanne's home. He writes up a memo. To make a long story short, it gets buried. And he gives it to Leanne, and Leanne gives it to Kurt. And at the same time, Leanne and others have connected to Dr. Mark Edwards, a MacArthur Fellow, expert in water who, in fact, had a role here in Washington in uncovering lead problems that have happened here. And that led to a citizen-led, independent water testing process that Nayyirah was a crucial part of. the independent water testing was so important because until this point, the state had been saying that the water is safe. The water is safe. And in fact, there's a graphic that I show oftentimes of little babies, a white baby and an African American baby, gleefully laughing with bubbles coming around their heads saying, you can drink the water. This is from the Department of Health and Human Services. You can bathe your babies. It's perfectly safe. So that's what people are being told. And so Dr. Edwards does this study. And they went door to door, very carefully collected all of these samples of water. He discovers that, in fact, the water is not safe. It's not safe at all. And so now you have a problem of he said, she said, right? You've got the state saying the water is safe. You've got this expert saying the water isn't safe. So Kurt decides to try to figure out what's going on. And he investigates the testing that the state did and discovers that it was rigged. It was rigged. They dropped from the test the highest lead sample. They went to streets to collect water samples that, whose infrastructure had been upgraded. And because of that, they were able to show that they were in compliance with the lead and copper rule, which isn't a very good rule to begin with, but they were able to show compliance. And so you now have validating the concerns of the citizens and the residents, this eminent expert with his own water study. You've got a critique of the state's water sampling. And so the validation has kind of begun. But still, the state was treating the residents' complaints and this information with utter disdain. We got our hands on an email that somebody in the Department of Environmental Quality sent to her boss, the director of the Department of Environmental Quality, who has since been fired, in which she says, Kurt gave the Del Toro memo to Michigan Public Radio, and they ran with it. And he was calling, trying to get a response from the Department of Environmental Quality to his results. And so in this email, she writes to her boss, must be what Kurt Guyette is calling about. I guess it's going to be a thing now. The complaints about the water. Leanne took bottles of water to the emergency manager and showed him Flint water and Detroit water. And she told him, my son has tested positive for lead. And the emergency manager told her she was a liar. So this is a story of unmitigated arrogance. It is a story of what happens when you take democracy away in a community and the utter disdain and unaccountability and what that kind of does to a bureaucratic culture, because this is not about government's failure. This is about the failure of a particular philosophy of government. So fast forward to last summer, Michigan Public Radio is running with the Del Toro memo. You've got the Edwards study out there, right? The voices are starting to lift a bit, starting to validate residents. And then Dr. Mona Atisha does her own study of lead poisoning of children because they've been following it. And she looks at 9 months before the switch to the Flint River and 9 months after, and she discovers astronomically elevated levels of lead in the children. Now the story isn't just about water and drinking water, it's about poisoned children. And then the shit hit the fan. Rachel Maddow picked it up. She started to beat a drum. She did not let go. The city voted out the mayor, and that was crucial, and elected Mayor Karen Weaver, and she immediately declared a state of emergency. That was absolutely crucial. She had no power to do it, no power under the law, but she went ahead and she declared a state of emergency, which I just really admire her for. And now we're kind of in the fall. You've got Rachel Maddow, you've got the mayor declaring the state of the emergency, you've got the independent water testing, you've got Dr. Atisha's study, and the rest is kind of history. This has been a transformative experience for all of us. As we look forward and we try to figure out where do we go from here, Some of the solutions are obvious. They'll be hard. I think yesterday's election in Michigan, if you look, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders won. I think that that's mainly a vote of anger. Michigan voters are furious. They're absolutely furious. They're furious about government inaction. Repealing the emergency manager law is obviously crucial. Improving our Freedom of Information Act is obviously crucial. Michigan is one of 2 states in the country that exempts the governor's office and the legislature from FOIA. So improving transparency, that's crucial. But this is also a challenge to us, people who care about human rights, people who are progressive, about how do we now build the bridges we need to build between state-based advocacy organizations, our elected officials, national advocacy organizations, and most importantly, the community. How do we pull together? There's no appropriation strategy out there yet. Money's kind of flying into Michigan, but there's no real philosophy. Who's going to own the responsibility for the long-term needs of this community? It's not just about bottled water. It's not even just about showers, as important as that is. But this is a city that has been destroyed by arrogance. It is a city that has been destroyed by austerity measures that completely lost sight of the people these elected officials are sworn to serve. Who is going to own the repair? And that's the big question.
Thank you, Kary. Michael?
So I don't know anything about Flint, so I don't know why I'm up here, but I have thought a bit about kind of the broader issues of government interventions in these sorts of situations where, that are initially triggered by some sort of fiscal crisis in a local government. And I think there's a lot of different ways states do those sorts of interventions, and there's a bunch of technical, boring differences, and you could sort of hash through that. But I'm going to highlight a couple of just broad problems that I think I've observed that has some relevance here, and just sort of some broad principles on, I think, where we need to go to make these things, both work better, basically. So one problem is that usually what triggers these things and what these things are all about is, it really they focus superficially on the fiscal problem as opposed to looking at what the underlying problem is that caused the fiscal problem. And there's a lot of different, and the reason that's important is that the remedy should actually match the real problem, not just match the fact that 2 numbers on a balance sheet aren't lining up. And so you have situations where the underlying problem is that the core economy of the community has been decimated for some reason, or that state aid has been cut, or that the state isn't giving sufficient taxing authority to the local government. There are all sorts of things that can cause these problems. And you can have someone come in and balance the books, but if you haven't really solved that underlying problem, you really haven't made much progress. And in fact, you may have made the problem worse, as particularly Kary was referring to. I mean, if you come in and you slash government services in an economy that's already weak, that's going to undermine progress on the underlying problem, not further it. And also the other thing you do is that you can also really polarize a community. You can undermine the social contract. You can do real harm to the democratic process. Aside from just the immediate effect on who has control while this takeover is in place, you can just undermine kind of faith in the quality of the dialogue in a community, which again, that's ostensibly all about the fiscal issues, but it undermines your ability to dive into the deeper underlying problems that a lot of these communities face. So that's in the case where the problem, is something like the economy or the relationship with the state is the underlying problem. Sometimes the underlying problem is, in fact, a problem of governance, right? It is a dysfunctional local government. And so some form of intense intervention is appropriate in certain circumstances, probably. But again, if it needs to hew to the fundamental principles of democracy, all the reasons we have democracy, do not go out the window because you have a local government that is behaving or doing things irresponsibly or not doing things it needs to do, and you still need all the stakeholders at the table, and you still need democratic processes, which sort of, leads me to the other problem I want to highlight with these interventions, is they kind of are premised on the idea that benevolent dictatorship is a good way of governing, right? And, a lot of people in this room probably think if I was the benevolent dictator of something, I could fix all the problems, right? And it can be efficient in some sense, but there is a reason why we as a society as a whole have not adopted dictatorship as our model of governance, right? And I don't need to explain why to this audience in particular, but those reasons don't all of a sudden go out the window because some community is in a fiscal crisis. So, I think that's important to keep in mind. And you can imagine situations where you might cut some corners on democracy in an acute crisis, but they're not situations where that last years long like these takeovers have. So, again, I just think that's a fundamental problem, is there's a false premise in this that somehow in this situation, dictatorship is the right way to go, but you'd never think about it for other contexts of governance. So I think those are a couple of just general problems. In terms of reforms the reforms I'm thinking of are in the same category, or relate to the problems, not surprisingly. And one is that before you do one of these interventions, there really should be some forensics as to what the underlying problem is, right? And the mandate for the state coming in, whatever the form of the intervention is, should be a mandate to deal with whatever the underlying problem is, and in fact a responsibility to do it, and not just balancing the books. And if that means the state kicking in some dollars or changing the way it does business, that needs to be part of it as well. And really, if the intervention is not doing that, you really there's really no rationale for the intervention, right? Because if there's no real reason to think that the state can actually deal with the underlying problem, if what's triggering it is a fiscal challenge, there's no real reason to think that a higher level of government can deal with that any better than a local level of government, unless you are dealing with the underlying problem. And the city's going to end up with the same problems as it had before, even if you do balance the books for a brief period. And the other thing is that the takeovers should not be takeovers. They should be a mechanism for collaboration. And that can be less efficient in some respects, but ultimately it's going to produce more lasting solutions. And now, that can be hard, right? A lot of the reasons why you have the takeovers because collaboration hasn't worked, or there's been some problem at the local government level. And, as Kary alluded and Nayyirah to some extent, sometimes there are really tough and hard choices which local governments have a really hard time doing. There's either powerful political forces locally that make it impossible, or, voters just don't want to own up to the fact that there's some really tough choices to make between different options. And, that's kind of when you get the examples where people cite to and say, we really did need a state takeover, are those kinds of examples, because they say, look, the local people couldn't own up and come up with the hard solutions, but we could come in and enforce those. And it's hard to get local cooperation for those sort of things. But a couple of things that I think would help create a more collaborative environment. One is, not to beat a dead horse, but be looking at the underlying problem, right? Because then you have something that actually the community is buying into. There's something they care about, because generally communities don't care about balancing the books particularly. They care about why you do that. They care about the underlying economy. They care about all those sorts of things. So one, it gives legitimacy to the process if you're actually addressing something that people care about. The other thing is, bringing state money to the table, frankly, because a lot of these things, you may have to, you can sort of ease the pain of some tough transitions that sometime have to be made if you bring some state money to the table, and that can make for a better collaborative process, and you can actually get buy-in from the community and not get these situations where everyone's at war and you can't really accomplish anything meaningful. Let me just end with just a couple of kind of mechanical things that I think also would help. States should be monitoring these situations more real time, and some states do this more than others. So it's not, right now it tends to be you either, the state isn't involved or, right, a big giant intervention. And if, in terms of reforming the process, there should be the monitoring, which some states already do, but also some forms of micro-interventions as you go along. Because states, the reason states can do this is because the cities are legal creatures of the state. So there are all sorts of small measures you could take to kind of push, if local governments are doing things they shouldn't be doing or you know, heading down a bad road, there are ways for the state to enforce that without waiting for it to be a full-blown crisis. And the other thing is that, you know, some local governments do get in trouble just because they have bad budgeting practices. They don't do long-term projections. They don't really own up to the consequences of the choices they're making. And so there ought to just be better practices, and they can be enforced by the state so you don't get into these situations. So, you know, I guess the two big things for me are, one, as I said, this really needs to be about addressing underlying problems, not just balancing the books, which can actually make things worse. And that, you know, there's a reason we kind of chose to have a democracy in this country, and those reasons don't go away just because a city's in a fiscal crisis. And I'll reference Flint. I think we can see that in Flint.
So we're going to take some questions, and let me just say, Common Cause is sort of made a commitment, and I'm very proud to say, made a commitment to work on the issues in Michigan. If you all have a question about whether or not our issues are interlinked with democracy, you are not paying attention. It is very clear to us that we have been out. I want to give credit to Melanie McElroy, who's the state director in Michigan, who's been on the front lines with our allied partners calling for transparency and accountability. Our members are supportive. We immediately launched a petition. Let me thank the national staff who, when we put the petition out first, and our chair, Robert Reich, helped us push it, we took in about 20,000 action takers in hours, record for us. And today we have a petition out there sort of calling for transparency, accountability, and then we're at about 70,000. It is clear to us as a citizen-based organization that every issue in terms of voting, but we need to look for what's next. How do we move forward in a positive way? Jenny said there's an opportunity here. There is. Opportunity for rich reforms around FOIA, opportunity to expand our voting rights, opportunity to look at great opportunities in this environment to think about linking our arms with our allies and maybe different strategic partners that we hadn't thought about before. There's an opportunity to move this national conversation and think about what in our allies' work, in our democracy work, where are the revenue generator ideas? Where is the economic development partners at our tables? It's going to be tough in Michigan. Let me sort of say one other thing that's really important here. It is a one-party-led government with no sight for relief. Kathy Fang is here. When I got to Common Cause, I wasn't so particularly passionate about redistricting. Let me be really clear about that. I didn't want that assignment. It was kind of complicated. Talked about maps and everything. She'd get in my ear. I really didn't want to hear it. I'd smile at her every day and think, oh, here she comes. Went with her to Ohio. But let me be clear. My 17 years here and this Flint crisis, we are not going to pass a real reform in that legislature without addressing the issue of redistricting in Michigan. And I will say, so I want to have questions. I see Miles saying, don't get emotional again. I already did that and rambled for the first 10 minutes, so I apologize for that. But you can see how it is an intense and an emerging conversation that we all welcome you to the table on. So I want to ask for some questions, Who has a question, please come to a mic. Okay, so somebody stick your hand up, jump up, Brother at the mic, go ahead.
Yes.
Please direct your question to somebody, and if not, we'll figure out who'll take
I
it.
think it's probably to everybody, because what I saw some research many years ago that essentially indicated that among communities, well, when you look at the migration patterns in the country, the people who have education, are young, newly married, and so forth, they move to where there are opportunities to get jobs and a better life and so forth. The people that are left behind are the elderly, those who are disabled, the poor, and so forth. So we have a pump in the country which disadvantages some communities over others. And when job bases erode and so forth, some communities are going to face a period of decline. Where I'm going is that the issues at hand I see as systemic. I grew up in Detroit, and it just amazes me that there's not more citywide or regional governance, that you can allow the core of the city to decline and the suburbs seem to have no responsibility for it. I look at Canada, for example, Toronto, where they have regional government and everything remains in balance. In other words, what I don't get is that we seem to be blaming the victim. In other words, a community falls into decline, we say it's their fault, and therefore what responsibility do we have for it? These are systemic effects, and we somehow have to see ourselves in the same boat and try to balance the whole picture. And our governance is so fragmented, and we're blaming the communities themselves that are in decline rather than blaming the system that sort of looked the other way as that decline took place and didn't provide some restorative and alternative paths to health, looking at it as a regional health as opposed to just every person on, for themselves. And I wondered if the panelists see this effect, if it's real, and also if they have any thoughts, if it is real, of how we could dig our way out of where we're at.
Nayyirah?
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. Like when you talk about regionalization, especially in Michigan, like you have to talk about race because that is one of the underlying drivers and narratives as to why we probably don't have a lot more things with that. Genesee County is one of the most racially segregated counties in the state, and the Metro Detroit area is one of the most racially segregated metropolitan areas in the country. So, like when you talk about like with some of that flight, a lot of the flight happened because they didn't want to live around Black people, and so you have to kind of unpack that in those communities before you could even move to that. Because I would say like the M1 rail system that's happening in Detroit and why it doesn't move outside of Detroit is kind of like one of these, I would say, just kind of a pinpoint of why you don't have some of this more, this collaboration across municipal lines.
Kary, do you have anything to add?
Only, I think that that's a really, really important point. And, I think what, to your point, we've inherited systems that don't work anymore in cities with declining populations. For example, Michigan schools are in terrible shape because the funding formula follows the children. So if you have children leaving a district in huge numbers, as is what's happened in Detroit, but you have fixed costs, you're just going to have less and less and less for children. And then there, of course, that has all that reality, the decline of the manufacturing industry and declining populations comes up against active policies that are intended, that reflect a particular philosophy of government. So one of the reasons that Flint got into the trouble it did and taken over by an emergency manager based on objective numbers is because of revenue sharing cuts. That's a state policy to the city. And so to Wendy's point about the importance of redistricting, we don't have in place the elected leaders we need to modernize the critically important issues facing urban areas like Flint and Detroit.
I mean, we also are very open to other ideas of voting that wouldn't get us to redistricting. I don't want us to put us in one box. I mean, I think part of this conference is to get us to think bigger about what we could do to relieve the situation. Yael?
Hi, I'm Yael from Common Cause. I want to thank you guys all. It's been a really wonderful discussion this morning. I think we heard of different potential democracy reform solutions, right? Gerrymandering, or redistricting rather, FOIA reform, emergency manager reform. I'm curious, especially from Nayyirah, but also from others, there's been this kind of suggested call for federal action. Can you make clear exactly what you'd like to see, what needs to happen on the ground in Flint so that we can move forward? Thank you.
Nayyirah?
Well, one of the things as we discover as we're fighting for water and stuff is there is no constitutional right to water at the federal level, and there also isn't a constitutional right to water at the state level. And as we're looking at some of those larger, I would say like policy actions, I think that probably needs to happen. Also, as far as a medical monitoring fund, like some money to replace like the infrastructure and to really like make our communities and bodies and infrastructure whole again. And I think that there needs to be a larger conversation of how we fund cities and how we invest in cities and urban communities, because for the longest time, like we funded sprawl, and that was kind of a philosophy, a land use philosophy that we've held near and dear, and especially in Michigan. And how do we reinvest in urban centers, especially as we have a whole generation of people now who don't want to live in bedroom communities. I grew up in a bedroom community. Like, I did not want to live in that as an adult, and that's the reason why I wanted to live in Flint. So how do we really support, I would say, those values, and how do we match our values with our funding priorities?
Any other questions?
Yeah, I would just quickly add, I didn't have a chance to mention, but with the Natural Resources Defense Council, the ACLU of Michigan filed a lawsuit under the Federal Safe Water Drinking Act. So that's moving forward, but you know, the ability to really determine how many pipes need to be replaced, all pipes getting replaced, when they should be, whether there might be unintended consequences of partial replacement is a really complicated issue that everybody's trying to figure out. And I think just this week, maybe some pipes started being replaced, but that's just like an immediate need that has got to get figured out. This has to be solved, just this immediate short-term need. And this lead and copper rule, I think, is a bit of a problem. It's a federal rule. It's what essentially allowed the state environmental department to fudge and kind of get around what turned out to obviously be a huge public health crisis. So those are a few things. Also, I want to say that the White House has, I think, reached out and been attentive, and the Michigan congressional delegation is doing everything they can. I wonder if we have the strategy that needs to be in place to, from a federal appropriations standpoint, figure out how to meet the long-term needs of this community and how to work with residents to make sure that what they feel needs to happen happens.
So I have a question for the panel as we wrap up here. You know, part of this is rebuilding the faith of government and our people to be participatory and engage. We're challenged with that. We have to really figure that out. So I want to ask you all what your thoughts are about what steps, absolute concrete steps, have to be taken to rebuild, begin to lay that long-term path to rebuilding the faith that people feel like they can own their government and have a place that didn't need some respect. So some thoughts about that, please.
Ending with an easy one?
That's the big one. That's why we're here.
I don't know why I'm going first. You know, actually, I do think that it's part of it is just showing that, you know, leaders are actually serious about addressing the problems people care about. And I think, again, I mean, you know, I'm coming back to what I said before, but it's just, you know, if you're coming in and you're saying you know, our vision is to make the books balance, you know, that is not going to inspire faith in government, right? So I just think, a willingness, and also just to be, having a little trust with people that you can have a serious conversation about what a community needs. I mean, the problems of older industrial cities are really hard, right? I mean, I was at a conference on older industrial cities a few years ago, and I was just struck by people saying these two things. One, there's all this infrastructure in these older industrial cities that we're just walking away from, how hugely wasteful that is. There are these great cities here, and we're just abandoning them. And then on the other hand, we need massive amounts of investment in these infrastructure that's all completely falling apart. And so we need like an adult conversation about those things and what's realistic for these cities and how can we do, and also focusing on the people. I mean, many people have moved out of these cities, has been noted, and so it's like, how do you balance sort of in the end, I don't think we care that much about the geographies, we care about the people, and so, how do those interact? Like, what investment should we be making in the geography versus what investments we should be making in the people? And I just think, having those kinds of dialogue as opposed to, balancing the numbers or just saying things like, oh, we're going to get GM to build a new plant here that's going to create 50,000 jobs like it used to be, people, that isn't a serious conversation either. So I just think that having more adult dialogue would help people have more faith that there's actually people thinking seriously about these problems that they should respect.
Thank you. Kary?
I think it's all good.
I think that we need to live our values in practice because in Flint, trust is broken. Like, our government poisoned us, and that's a statement of fact. That's not like, like somebody going crazy town, like it actually happened. And I would say like the actual federal employees who are in the city of Flint right now, so the EPA, Health and Human Services, the CDC, we had people from the Surgeon General's office. Like, we were very intentional in bringing like those officials in front of real people so they could express their frustration, their anxiety, their disdain, their distrust. And there needs to be, I would say, a response that actually respects the experiences that people have had for the past almost nearly 2 years. In April, next month, it will be 2 years since the move to treat Flint River water. And in the city of Flint, just in general, like, our democracy has been stripped by our state government. And as we move forward to healing, like, we need spaces where we can have those conversations of how we actually fund cities and what does reciprocity and reparations look like in practice, and not being afraid to have those conversations and worrying about whether you got the votes to do it, because big picture ideas, like, you need dreams and fortitude to make that happen.
So I thought Kary was going to say it, but we'll say it. If there isn't some accountability put down on the elected officials in Michigan, I don't know how we restore the faith. I think there's a lot of discussion about if a corporation poisoned the water, there would be fines, there would be prison, there would be time, there would be something. People want that, to be honest. The woman in the...
And I think that's actually exactly the question or a point that was made here that I wanted to pick up and ask about that you guys are now just addressing. First of all, thank you so much for being here this morning and for bringing your experience here to us personally. It's an honor to hear about the fight that you're in, and we're all so angry for you and supporting the work that you are doing, so thank you. I think you said something, Kary, that this is a failure of a particular philosophy of government and not necessarily of government itself. And Nayyirah, you were just saying, people need to be able to talk about big ideas. Trust is completely broken, understandably. But then how do we move forward understanding that, without some sense of government, without a progressive government, how do we reclaim that government and encourage the participation and then the participatory structures to be built from the ground up? And so to be able to talk about the big ideas of rebuilding trust in a better progressive vision of government and separating out this particular failure of the Emergency Manager Acts and all the ways in which they were taking democracy away from the people.
Well, in Flint, our emergency, Darnell Early, when he came into office, he said he's changing the form of government and put a ballot to change our charter. So now our charter is open, and who knows what that's going to be. But when I failed to mention that we do pay one of the highest rates for water in the nation, and also in Flint, they were at one point in time prosecuting people for quote unquote stealing water. So I pay $158 a month. Many people pay $200 to $300 a month for water. And if they cannot pay their water bill, they can potentially lose their home through the tax foreclosure process. But I think people going to jail, that's how you're gonna rebuild trust in Flint and begin to see that you can't poison the community and get away with it scot-free.
Okay, I think that first let's give them a round of applause. I want to take a minute to recognize all the activists and allies and people on the ground in Flint and those that are coming together to make this story be out in the spotlight and some solutions. So I want to give them a round of applause that are home and back at I want you to know that this is a tough story to discuss and hard to put together, but we welcome your, I'm sure, questions after or to the side, incoming thoughts going forward. Common Cause will play a role. Sierra Club is on the ground. Many people are. So we are excited to be here today, and I want to just give my final thank yous to you all. Thank you.